welcome to what is our first Crossfire Cafe in Poland, and based on Aspen Review Café. Back to it immediately. My name is Hodáč, and I'm the chairman of Aspen Institute Central Europe. Aspen Institute Central Europe is part of the Aspen family. Many of you know Aspen. Many of you wear Aspen ties as the new Italian ambassador to Poland. Last time at your reception, I was so happy to see you with that tie. And Aspens today are in Europe, in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Central Europe, which covers Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. We are also trying to work with the Slovenians, with the Austrians. We are trying to be really Central Europeans. Aspen is also in Ukraine and Romania, and there are Aspens also in India, in Japan, and in Mexico. The ones of you who don't know what is the Aspen Institute and what is the purpose what the Aspen Institute is doing, very shortly, it's not a think tank. The Aspen Institute is not publishing any studies. Aspen Institute is a platform for a dialogue about values. I put it very shortly, about values of an open, liberal, democratic society. And I think that when we look at ourselves today, I think we really need this dialogue, and we need this platform. So the Aspen Institute have their role today more than probably ever before. Among the other things which the Aspen Institute is doing, Aspen Institutes, and among them obviously the Central European one, we have a special Young Leaders program. We take young children between 30 and 40 and young leaders, and we have 3-4 days program for them where we invite leading personalities from cultural life, from academia, from political sides, and elsewhere. We organize conferences, roundtables, and of course we publish also the Aspen Review. We have some of them there, it's for free. And this is the third number of this year. It's called The Face of Europe, and for each of the review, as I have mentioned at the beginning, we are organizing what we call a Cross Cafe. So welcome to the first Cross Cafe of the Aspen Institute Central Europe in Warsaw. I would like very much that this becomes an open debate. To have an open debate, we have to have somebody who introduces the topics, and I have with me here two excellent persons who can do that. On my left side, Ambassador Janusz Reiter. You were Polish ambassador to Germany, you were the Polish ambassador to the United States, and you are the chairman of the board of the Center of International Relations in Warsaw, but you are also founder of that institute. On my right side, an old friend of mine, Roland Freudenstein, policy director in the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels. He is not one of the Brussels bureaucrats. He is. It's a compliment. I don't think it's a compliment. So back to our topic after this short introduction. The discussion today, and we can discuss anything you want, but the basis is the face of Europe. So we should talk about Europe. We should talk about the European Union. Sometimes I wonder, when we say Europe, what do we mean? Do we mean European Union? Do we mean Europe as such? Some people still make a difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and when you say to the Eastern Europeans that you are from Eastern Europe, they do not always appreciate it. So Europe has many faces. Europe has many faces inside Europe, but also outside Europe. And as I have spoken to somebody, I've been discussing with somebody before we started, in fact somebody from the College of Europe, and there are also people here from the College of Europe, some of them from Netherlands, some of them from Bruges. Europe is facing today a number of problems that we have never faced before. We are talking about migration, immigration, we are talking about other issues, but when you put them together, it is a mountain. And I don't think we ever had something like that. We had crisis in 2008, 2009. We had then the Greek crisis, we had Ukraine, we had other things that came together, and we thought that it's too much. And now suddenly, and I will finish with this, when you look at the crisis that we are facing, and I will take them as they come, and they are definitely not complete. Populism, the rise of populism, Brexit, we will discuss internal divide, East's divide inside the European Union, and internal divide as such. Leadership, we face obviously leadership problems, credibility. The European Union, in eyes of many, is losing credibility. External problems, and that's not only Russia and China, but it's also our old friends, from across the ocean. We have lots of problems today with President Trump. Migration, globalization. We thought that globalization would be a benefit of everybody, and guess what? Suddenly, people are afraid of it. New technologies, uncertainty that the young people are facing whether they will get jobs. Brain drain inside the European Union, outside the European Union. Terrorism, alienation between Brussels and the capitals, demographic problems and others. I will not go further. What are we going to do with it? What is the situation today? And how is Europe, or the European Union, going to look next year after the parliamentary election? And how is Europe going to look in 2030? Are we going to deal with it? Are we going to have a Europe superstate? Are we going to have, is the whole thing going to disintegrate? Are we going to go back to the small nation states? What do you think should happen, will happen, and obviously nobody has a crystal ball, but let's have an open debate about I go back to the original title, the face of Europe, and how the face looks today and how it will be changing. So, I take it on my left side.
Thank you so much.
Janusz,
thank
you.
Thank you.
5-8 minutes open remarks, and then we open it to the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Also seeing so many friendly faces, among them a face of Europe from the US. I will never forget Richard Holbrooke's essay, the famous essay, "The US is a European Power." And not only in this meaning, this is a European face of the US. Something that I think is encouraging today, because this cannot be taken for granted. Dan, it's great to see you here, and I feel privileged to be able to speak here. This is not my first time with Aspen. However, I was often with Aspen Berlin. I remember an event in 1989, and there was one of the stars of this event was a lawyer from the GDR, Wolfgang Schnur, and he was one of the leading representatives of that opposition. Unfortunately, 3 or 4 months later, it turned out that he was a prominent collaborator of the Stasi. And so this gave this event a special taste. But that was a time when Germany made this experience almost every day. So I had, as I said, a lot to do with Aspen Berlin, but I know that we are under the leadership of Aspen Prague, and we are happy to be under the leadership of Aspen Prague. A couple of remarks. First, unlike in the past, we cannot even dream of fixing Europe in the traditional sense. There was a problem, and the question was, how do we find the solution for this problem, and then we would be able to restore the order in Europe again. I think that we can forget that. There will be no return to what was. There will be, we are witnessing a reshaping of the world, including Europe. And of course, there is no recipe for doing that. The traditional method of addressing the problem that Europe had to deal with in the past, this is no longer valid. And that makes everybody uncertain about the future. We have, and this is also new, we have multiple crises. One of this crisis is caused by the globalization. The globalization has, of course, a major impact on Europe, after all, because it led to, it made differences between European states visible, and it showed that Europe became a competitive place, unlike the perception in the past. The perception in the past was that there would be winners only. No one could be a loser. That was against the definition of the European project. So you would not be allowed to be a loser. And suddenly we are in a situation where some countries feel that they are winners and some feel that they are losers. This changes totally the perception of the European Union. And it is not only about the strength of the economy. This is also, of course, about the state or the efficiency of the states. We see gaps between European states. In some European states, in the past, the confidence in the European institutions in Brussels was higher than the confidence and the trust in the national institutions. And I always believe that that was no reason to feel happy, unlike some people. And now we see exactly the consequences of that. Without a well-functioning state and without a certain level of trust in the nation states, you will not make people better Europeans. So you cannot just jump over the nation state into Europe and then expect that all your problems will be solved. This is, of course, also something totally new and surprising, also from Poland. In the past, in many countries, people believed that there was no problem in the nation states that Europe would not have a solution for. Now, there are few people who believe that Europe is the solution. There are many people, unfortunately, who believe that Europe is a problem. The career, the rise, the popularity of President Macron stems from the spirit, from the new spirit that he brought in to the European discussion, by saying, I believe that we cannot fix France without Europe. Of course, the message, the actual message was, I need the access to the European resources, because I know that my national resources are too limited to fix the problems. But that sounds very European, and of course Macron has been praised as the great European, and I'm not questioning that. But in many countries, people do not believe that they can get access to the European resources, and that will help them fix their problems. They believe that they can fix their problems by isolating their countries, by cutting them off from the rest of Europe. And unfortunately, even the Macron method has a limited value and is seen with some skepticism in many countries, growing skepticism in France, but also in Germany, for example. The second problem that we are dealing with is, of course, not just a European problem. This is the crisis of the liberal democracy, a problem of the entire Western world. For the first time, we are having in the world not just autocracies or dictatorships. There always were dictatorships, but we have successful autocratic systems, and this is something new. We know, the veterans of the Cold War, we of course know failing autocratic systems, and we knew that we felt that it would be only a question of time, and they were doomed to fail. Well, who would say the same about those autocratic countries that we are having in today's world? Unfortunately not, and so many people are watching that and come to the conclusion that there are maybe other solutions, and these solutions may be more useful than the solutions offered by the liberal democracy. And the third point is Europe was not prepared for so to speak, meeting or confronting the outside world. Europe was built as a sort of island. Europe was absent in global politics, and this was seen as a virtue. And actually, this was also wanted by the US. The US wanted the European countries, the Western countries of course, to make their contributions to NATO, to the West, but they didn't want them to play an independent role in world politics. And the European countries were happy not to have to play this role, because playing this role is about making decisions, making hard decisions. The Europeans preferred criticizing the US for making sometimes mistakes, because they did not have to make any decisions, so they could not make any mistakes. And now, suddenly, this model does not work anymore. First, because the world is confronting Europe from the south, the world represented by the refugees, by the migrants, and the West is confronting Europe from other sides, especially here in Europe, and especially in this part of Europe, from the east. The new experience in Europe also is you cannot make mistakes without paying a price for them. Every mistake has a price. That was also the difference in the old Europe under Cold War, or even then later on in the 1990s. One of the consequences of this is that the US is coming and saying, no, we are no longer going to pay the same price as in the past for your security. The message is not new, of course. The message came also from the former presidents, but this president gives more fire to his speech, as we know, and this is why suddenly we have to take it very seriously. So, how do we deal with that? How do we prepare Europe for dealing with global problems? How can we bring Europe to the point where it can take a real share in the global responsibility? This will not happen via the Brussels institutions. I'm convinced of that. That can only happen if there are enough ambitious countries that have the resources to play such a role, and who can get together and who get then a sort of approval for this role from the other European countries. This will be a long, long road, but I think it's absolutely necessary. Europe needs to take more responsibility in the world, not as a counterweight to the US. That would be absurd. Now, within the Western world, with the US, whoever is the president of the US, I think we have to also learn that this is not about so much about style, this is not so much about aesthetics, this is about interests and values. And here, last sentence, that's another difference, another problem we are facing. How do we reconcile interests and values? The only Western power that in the past was able to create a balance between interests and values was the US. Europe was good at values. not so good. And interest. I mean, in the sense of power. The U.S. stood for power and for values. Europe stood for values. Now, everybody says, well, Europe needs power. Okay, but how do you reconcile power and values? We don't know. Unfortunately, the US is also shifting from the traditional balance and is saying now it's balance, it's power stupid. And values, some people still, like Wilfried, believe that values are important for the US, but there are some influential people who believe that values are not that important for the US. Well, how do we deal with that? We have to find our own definition. This definition will take us the privilege that we enjoyed in the past of not making mistakes because of not doing anything in the global business. This time is over. I mean, this is not, what I'm saying is not, I'm not predicting the end of Europe. I'm just saying these are enormous changes. Of course, these changes need strong leaders and need countries that have the self-confidence to meet them. I wish Poland was one of those countries, and I still hope it will. I wish Germany was one of those countries, and I still do hope that it will. And of course, I wish that France will be one of those countries, as well as Italy, a country that has enormous resources. We cannot waste anymore those European resources. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this excellent overview. I understand three points. First, let's forget that we ever get back to where we started. Europe is going to be different and it will play a different role. And what you said is interesting. There will be not only winners. We are used to having only winners. Suddenly, it's not the case. Second, the crisis of the global democracy, but that's a global phenomenon. We are not the only ones in it. And third, the global responsibility and Europe being able to confront the outside world in terms of its own security, interest, values, and other aspects. Roland, up to you now.
Thanks, Ivan. First of all, thanks for having me. Second, I think about half of you don't need an explanation what the Armińskie Radio jokes were. Or arguably, I mean age-wise, arguably it was the most successful cycle of jokes in the old Soviet Union. And they were terribly, terribly fashionable in West Germany in the 1970s. You know, Nord Stream 2, Apollo, it was all there already. Maybe less in Poland, but anyway. So, the principle of Yerevan jokes was always a more or less absurd question to a fictitious radio station, which was answered by, in principle, yes, but, and then there was a total rebuttal, actually, of the question. I'm not going to give you an example here, but yeah, I should. Is it true, question to the Armenian Red, is it true that they are giving away Mercedes limousines for free on Red Square in Moscow? And the answer is, в принципе, да, no, in principle, yes, but it's not Red Square in Moscow, it's Nevsky Prospect in Leningrad. It is not Mercedes limousines, but bicycles, and they're not given away for free, but stolen. So in that sense, when I come back to the questions that Ivan asked at the invitation here, is Brexit the beginning of the end of Europe? Are we facing a European superstate or the disintegration of the EU? Are France and Germany going to drive integration in the future? Is the Visegrad Group isolating itself through non-membership in the Eurozone? В принципе, нет. No. There is I don't think that any of these questions can be answered with a straight yes, but of course there is some danger, there are some dangers, there are some shocks under the surface, and Janusz Reiter has beautifully outlined them. I would just like to instead of disagreeing with him, which is impossible, I would just like to make some additional remarks to the points he made. So if we come to globalization winners and losers, it's true that countries look at themselves differently in this scale of winners and losers. But I think the most important difference is within countries, is within groups of populations of countries, where parts of the population see itself as a loser, from Kentucky to the British Midlands to maybe parts of Poland too. Whereas other parts in major cities, the people that voted the Koalicja Obywatelska yesterday, in the big cities of Poland, they see themselves rather on the winning side. And that is the main problem for our democracy. It's not to contradict you, Janusz, but I think it's an aspect that's important to emphasize. When we come to this question of trust in European institutions, or lack of trust in the European institutions, I'm afraid it's even more than that. Viktor Orban said something really, really nice recently. He said, in the 90s, we used to say Europe is our future. Today, we are Europe's future. So I mean, this takes it to the next level. It's not only that the Commission and these rusty Brussels institutions are a problem. It is that actually Europe's new conservatives, as they would define themselves, or Christian Democrats, as they would say themselves, or you might say Europe's new authoritarians or autocrats, actually believe that they are the wave of the future. I mean, it's my thesis that every deep political conflict is about precisely this question. Who represents the future and who's stuck in the past? It was true, it is in the Brexit question, it was in the migration crisis. It's always, each side tries to paint itself as the only viable, the only conceivable way how we can continue. Whereas the other side are respectively, 19th century nationalists or hippies stuck in the 1970s. That was the migration crisis, more or less, in a nutshell. So again, this is just an additional observation to what Janusz said, and I think it makes it even more difficult than just along the scale of trust or lack of trust in European institutions. And now the external challenges, the successful autocrats. I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is what basically China stands for today. There are probably a couple of other countries in the near future. But China is the most evident, successful autocracy at the moment, which actually seems to contradict everything that we've come to believe after 89, or even before 89, but for which the number 89 stands as a cipher, if you want. 89 stands for basically the market economy and liberal democracy, and the mutual dependency of both upon each other. China seems to defy that rule. You don't need political freedom to have economic prosperity. And that is indeed a hard thing to swallow. And I think just to say it's going to take a little longer is of course simplistic. But that's the beginning of the answer. And I think the other part of, I'm whistling in the dark here, but let's remember that there were a couple of times in the 20th century when Western democracy seemed finished. And when it seemed like liberal democracy was not the future. Such a moment had definitely arrived in the 1930s. And arguably, the time around the Sputnik shock, it was by no means clear that the West would win the Cold War. And yet, it did. It just took a little longer. I would say the pessimism and sometimes bordering on defeatism of Western democracy, liberal democracy, with all its external and internal challenges, is nevertheless premature. And I think we have a couple of success stories that we can point to. and the fact that people still risk their lives or their health or their careers for abstract ideas such as freedom and civic liberties. In places like Hong Kong or Russia or other parts of the world should actually encourage us. Last word about the Europeans as the vegetarians among the carnivores. This is the new version of Bob Kagan's Venus and Mars. You know, in 2003 it was Venus versus Mars. Today, I think there was some other intellectual said this first about carnivores. I think it's Bob Kagan himself who started it, but Sigmar Gabriel, former German foreign minister, picked it up in his speeches recently and keeps talking in these terms. But on the one hand, I think Europe cannot become, structurally, impossibly become a carnivore like the US certainly are under Trump, or used to be, at least in terms of their methods and conception of power in the past. On the other hand, of course, we have to try harder to at least combine these two worlds a little bit more and not remain completely on one side. And that stands and falls with my country, Germany. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of my country, but I do think that here Germany is pivotal and Germany is performing terribly recently. I mean, in the last 15 years, there were several moments when you had the impression that finally Germany's political class was beginning to get it. Speeches by the federal president at the Munich Security Conference talking about, yes, we have to do more military operations abroad, overseas, and we have to definitely spend more on defense. And a defense minister who started to begin to talk about fallen soldiers, a word that did not exist in post-war German jargon about actual military operations. The Chancellor, who says that, in her usual slightly meandering way of expressing herself, said that since we cannot count 100% on all of our partners in all situations, we will, to a certain extent, have to take our fate into our own hands. Took her some time to bring out this last couple of words, but that's exactly it. And yet, militarily, it is not happening in Germany. Because there's no political party that actually advocates for a stronger military, for actually operational military forces, for a qualitative jump in overseas missions and combat missions and so on. We hide behind our past. We hide behind the fact that numerically we're the third biggest contributor to international, to NATO operations and so on. All this is just nonsense. I have to say it that way, because our ships aren't seaworthy, our tanks don't shoot, our planes, our helicopters don't fly, and we have the one big thing in common with Austria, that we have no operational submarines. And this is untenable, and I tell you, the only political party that would actually change this today would be AfD, because of the number of ex-service people in their ranks, police and military, also in their corpus and Bundestag. So this has to change, and this is my final plea to our partners, East and West and North and South, our German partners, East and West, North and South of Germany, is give us pressure. It's like, encourage Germany to not hide behind its painful past, and just contribute more to European security for its own sake and for your own sake. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. Thank you for elaborating on many of the issues that Janusz has been mentioning, and thank you for stressing also China. Thank you for stressing Germany and putting a lot of emphasis on it. And thank you for mentioning also the trust in the European institutions. I think that all these issues are extremely relevant. I will now open the debate to the floor. Contributions, comments, questions to any of our speakers. Who is going to start?
I have two questions. One is, vis-à-vis China, it would be advisable that the European Union will be able to defend its economic interests. Is Europe capable politically and administratively, taking into account that there is a lot of energy consumed by Brexit negotiations, and we don't have energy to negotiate one voice outside. So that's China economy. The second thing is the recent announcement that US is going to withdraw from the intermediate missiles treaty. Are we going to come back to the 80s, to the times of Pershing SS-20 debate, and what does it mean for European defense? Two easy questions.
Okay, Janusz, pick one of them. China
Seems to be an easier question. At least because I think people in Europe are more sober, more realistic about China today than 10 years ago. I remember 10 years ago there was a competition between the European states who is the better friend of China. And there was a sense that those who get a better relationship with China have a privilege in Europe, a competitive advantage against the others. Of course, everybody was preaching a European approach, but actually the reality was totally different from that. Even in this country, in this region, there was a great deal of enthusiasm about China. In Poland, some people believed that China would be the alternative to Germany, because people were concerned that there was too much German investment. Of course, they wanted more, but on the other, they wanted more investment, but why always from Germany? China would be so nice, so neutral. This is over. I think people are realizing that China is not neutral, not at all. And so that's one important precondition for a common action. But actually, I'm afraid the only precondition, because we are still far from a common action. But I think this is doable, because because the China issue is not about emotions, as some other issues are. The relationship with the US is a very emotional topic. Of course, Russia is an extremely emotional topic. China is not such an emotional topic. So I think we can come to a common position on China. And of course, we have to. The problem is what does it mean? And we can come to a common position on trade with China, but for that we need the US, which is, of course, psychologically difficult. And second, if we want to compete with China, we need some real assets, because the question is, will Europe play any role in the future economy with artificial intelligence, with cyber defense, cyber security, or will Europe be irrelevant? And this is, of course, a much more difficult question. How can we pool the European resources to make Europe a player in this competition? This is, in general, the new problem. We have to learn competition. A lot of European companies have been very good at global or international competition, but Europe has no idea whatsoever how to compete against other regions or how to become part of a wider competition. The other question, I have to admit, I do not know that. My sense is, but it's interesting to see that the British reaction is very sober, is very distant, while the German reaction, of course, is very emotional. That reflects the problem that Roland spoke about. And here, of course, this may be a first test for Germany. Not that I'm saying that this decision is good, but the question is, will Germany be able to come to a sober, realistic judgment of this decision? And only then Germany and Europe will be able to discuss with the US what the right position of Europe could be.
Yeah, I'm also tempted by China. I think that, first of all, the year 2017 was a fantastic trajectory in the China debate in Europe. Starting with the idea, around the Davos speech of Xi Jinping, when he seemed to be the defender of global openness vis-a-vis Donald Trump, who had just ditched that principle with the bin. And by the end of the year, the EU had gone through a traumatic summit, EU-China summit, at which Chinese completely blocked everything. The Economist had 4 cover stories, negative about China, and very important, intellectually important institutions like, for example, the Mercator Institute in Berlin and the Global Public Policy Institute have published studies about Chinese sharp power, authoritarianism on the march, how China uses economic influence and financial investments to further its political goals. It actually is maybe not as brutal as Putin's Russia, but quite determined to actually completely overrule the liberal democracy and its guiding principles. So, that was a fantastic trajectory within 1 year. And I think the conclusion here is, indeed, many Europeans are becoming much more aware now of the dangers and pitfalls of a too strong involvement with China, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't have economic relations, but we need to be much more selective. We need to compartmentalize our relationship with China into points where we can actually cooperate with them, including maybe climate policy, points where we are competitors, and points where we are antagonists with China, and we need to see it as such. And in these points, we still need to team up with good old America. Read this week's Economist, the lead story, title story, and the first op-ed piece. For the first time, the Economist has basically something good to say about Donald Trump, because they say that his shock and awe tactics with China may actually work. Definitely works better than any kind of rational, softy, negotiating approach that the West as a whole had in the past with China. That there seems to be something in the no-holds-barred, tough approach that this president is using with China. And one more point. We urgently need more independent expertise on China. Please, no financing by the Confucius Institute, Chinese universities, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, or what have you. This is poisoned money. We need independent, look, we're rich enough to afford a few more funds for China research at our universities and in particular research institutes in Europe. We're definitely rich enough for that. And we should play hardball on that level too. And finally, we need to, again, this comes back to the global dimension of the European Union. We need to reach out to China's neighbors. Because in fact, there's a couple of countries that are not very happy about the way China is acting in the region, and that will be extremely grateful if the West as a whole, that means the United States and Europe, reach out to them and at least exchange some views, some information, some analysis, and maybe hatch out common strategies, how to cope with China's increasing assertiveness. So I mean, these are just a few points, but I think we need to get our act together on China, but I see chances for this. And just one tiny word about the US withdrawal from the INF. I fail to panic here. Russia has been violating that treaty consistently under Putin for the last 10 years or so, and I don't see any reason why this should now be a disaster. You know, we are in a confrontation with Russia, which has many aspects. One of them, of course, is about military equipment, and if you want a kind of arms race, and well, we won the last one. I don't think there is much probability that we'll lose this one.
Yes, thank you very much. I must say that on China, I'm afraid that we are kind of the boat has gone, and we will have difficulties to get it. When you see that China today controls most of the precious metals around the world, in Africa, in Chile, other places, the precious metals that we are going to need for the new modern technologies, for the electric cars, or computers and everything else, and we are just staring at it, and we are saying that we have to get our act together, we need more studies, etc., etc. In the meantime, the business community is selling to the Chinese every single technologies that they want. And if we believe that we have, and we have said it for a long time, that we have technological advantage over the Chinese, we don't have. The people who come out of the Chinese universities and the ones who return from the United States, 20% of Chinese studying in the United States return back to China immediately. So we should never forget that. And what is absolutely incredible to me on this one, if I may ask the moderator, is the rules-based trade. You open China daily, and it's full of rules-based trade. I mean, the Chinese today are talking about rules-based trade. It's really talking. And at the end of the day, I'm sorry, but when Trump has thrown into the wastebasket in January 2017, the TPP, what happened in Davos, the Chinese have said that we are free traders, and that said everything. Sorry. That was another question.
There is so much to agree with here. I find myself in an optimistic mood, belying the politics both in the United States and in Europe, but thank you for this, because there's hope. And I want to tease out something you both said separately, which is new and important, because I wonder whether the solution to the current malaise of the West lies along this path. Janusz, you mentioned the importance of not underestimating the nation state and not counting on the Brussels institutions to save Europe. And Roland, you mentioned the lack of German power, which reminded me of Reiter famous speech where he said, as a Pole, he finds German weakness more concerning than German strength. The issue of the nation state and the need to link national patriotism to values and a common purpose strikes me as a profound political challenge. I think that one of the problems in Central Europe especially is that people like the Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Slovaks overthrew communism in the name of democracy, values, and the nation. And they saw the two as linked. In Poland, za waszą i naszą wolność, which was a patriotic slogan. And it turns out that these countries leapt into a post-national utopia of Europe, where patriotism was regarded as something dangerous and mildly inferior. I'm exaggerating, but I'm trying to make a point that we, the people who believe in a West based on the nation and values, need to recapture the nation without sacrificing values. My problem with Trumpism is that he talks about sovereignty as an absolute, which is wrong and dangerous because it elevates the nation to the highest value, which it surely cannot be. But you both identified a deeper political need that I suspect is correct. And then, so my question is this true? On the issue of whether China proves that the autocratic development is proof of concept of autocratic development, I still, Bob Kagan is a friend, he says yes, I'm not so sure. And the autocratic development argument is being used by a lot of people, including Mohammed bin Salman. Which that model looks a little less shiny than it did 3 weeks ago. So I'm not sure. But the notion of the nation and giving Europe a second wind of commitment led by nations but not giving up Europe. Is that what you meant? Is that possible? I think it's essential for my own country, but happily this is not a discussion of the United States.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Dan. I believe that, first, I agree with everything you said. Second, I believe that the national question somehow was always present in Europe. It was not articulated the way we are doing it maybe today. I remember, I read somewhere a sentence by I think Michel Debré, the former French Prime Minister, who said, and there were more people in France who spoke about that in a similar way. He said, namely, I'm not afraid of a strong Germany. I'm afraid of a weak France. The question in Poland, the problem in Poland is that suddenly people came to the conclusion that this country is too weak to be part of an open Europe. And while in the 1990s and a little bit later on, the dominant belief was that, okay, we are smaller, weaker, but the other ones are interested in us growing. And then came the other way of thinking. Don't fool yourself. If you are weak and your neighbor is strong, your neighbor, it's like in the jungle. Your neighbor will kill you. So before your neighbor kills you, try to kill your neighbor. But this is, unfortunately, a very popular way of thinking in today's Europe. So Europe no longer as a place of mitigating conflicts and tensions, but as a sort of jungle. And suddenly the traditional language of the pro-European forces appeared to be naive. And that was the message of the new forces. Don't fool yourselves and don't fool the people. But this is about hard struggle. We have to be, we have to fight very hard. But the problem is that the alternative appeared to be naive, because it makes little sense to propagate what you call the post-national utopia. That does not work. The real alternative is a continent that, of course, is not free of competition. There is competition, but there is a sort of controlled, managed competition, because you have common rules, you have common values, and that protects the weaker ones against an aggressive use of power by the stronger ones. I still believe that this model can work, but of course we have to revise our attitude toward the nation states. So the nation state is not over in Europe, and of course it's not over in the US. I have to admit that I was a little bit surprised because I always believed the US was not just a nation state. The US is a continent, it is an empire, so it's free of the temptations of a nation state. Well, it seems not quite, Czasami, yeah, quite. And I believe also that it was so good for Europe to have the US in Europe because the American presence helped us create a balance between the European countries. And we are facing the problem of how do we re-establish restore a balance between the European countries with a weaker presence of the US, or if the US taking a course that the Europeans or the part of Europe does not accept. Without the US as a European power, to quote again Richard Holbrooke, it would have been much more difficult to create a European balance. And now we have to do that. And it's of course extremely difficult. Because look at Germany. Angela Merkel became extremely unpopular in the south of Europe because the people in the south of Europe, especially in Greece, believed that she pursued an austerity policy at the expense of those countries. Angela Merkel, of course, made a lot of real contributions to the solution, but she had to be aware of the problem of the mood of the German population. If she had gone further, she would have lost the confidence of the German people. Today, Germany is still a country where, I don't know, 70% or so of the population of the public says Europe is good for us. This cannot be taken for granted, but it has a price. So creating a balance between the nation states and the national and the European level is extremely difficult, but that's exactly what it is all about. And I wish, again, the US helped. I do not understand why the US suddenly seems to consider the European Union a trouble more than well, part of the solution. But without the US, integrated Europe would have been impossible. And this seems to be totally forgotten in today's US. So Dan, it's your mission to remind these people, because people sometimes forget things that happened even 20 years ago, and even more 30, 40 years ago, but it takes people who remember that, who know that, and who know that all these messages are not anachronistic, that they are still very, very valid.
Thank you very much, Ron, Germany.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for that question. No, before I come to Germany, one word about the US. Now, I think it would be unfair to say the US is now looking at the EU as an enemy or something, or detrimental to US interests. Trump has said this repeatedly. There's a couple of people around him who believe this. But there is an exasperation about the Europeans, which goes far beyond the Trumpista circles in Washington. A frustration which seems to say, I mean, we've been telling them for decades they need to get their act together, and they don't. And yes, ultimately you can say there was always a bit of a double bind in the US attitude to Europe. You know, we want you to shoulder more of the burden, but we don't want you to be too cocky in international affairs and, God forbid, counter our diplomacy like in the JCPOA with Iran and so on and so on. Yes, that has always been there, but tell me one superpower that does not deal in double binds with its partners to a certain extent. So I still think that while it's unfair by Trump to, and it's historically untrue, the EU was not created to cheat the US and exploit poor American workers. No. The EU was actually helped a great deal by the United States in the Cold War. And because the US saw that those, you can't leave those Europeans alone. You know, they'll be at each other's throat again in a couple of years. So, you know, all this means that we still have to get our act together, and we have to do it together with our partners. And fortunately, there are more powers and institutions and organizations around in the United States than Donald Trump in the White House. Now, Dan is one of them. But on Germany, yeah, you know, our imperialism used to come in boots, now it comes in Birkenstock sandals. You know, that's also referring especially to the migration crisis. You know, when I was a teenager, it was de rigueur when you defined yourself, you had to say, I'm a Rhinelander, I'm a European, and then maybe somewhere as a third or fourth point, I'm German. You know, the first two were interchangeable. The third one was not. It had to be the last one. You had to emphasize how little Germany meant to you. That was West Germany in the 70s. And I'm afraid, after the fall of the wall, too many of us in Germany have believed that we are the future. Remember the thing about, like, you are the past, I'm the future. I believe that we are the future. The others are just a little bit too slow or dim-witted or stuck in the 19th century, but they will come along eventually. In a kind of, in seeing the light that the nation state is evil and that, you know, to harp on national sovereignty and so on is a bad thing. That has guided us right up to the, coming back to it again, the migration crisis, when we believed that we were the moral champion, the world champion. I mean, I'm quoting newspaper cover stories of the second half of 2015. So, you know, and the idea that the nation state is deeply, or democracy is deeply connected with the nation state does not appear in this formula here that I'm describing to you. The fact that, you know, Germany also, of course, Timothy Garton Ash wrote a 2-inch book about this, how Germany promoted its national interest in Europe's name, which is the title of the book. And he really turns every pfennig 3 times and looks at all arguments from all sides, but he does come to the conclusion that yes, Germany did, of course, do Europe because it was in its own national interest, and it very often packaged its demands into general European rhetoric. So, to make a long story short, I think the nation state is not finished. I think that recognizing this and admitting it would already go some way to address also the frustrations that there are about the bureaucracy in Brussels and some of what the European institutions do. And there is a certain, I'm using the word now, globalist conviction that indeed resembles the Germans in the 1970s, that nation states are a thing of the past. You know, I mean, this is also said outside of Germany by the people with the jobs in multinational corporations, or the people who, you know, can work at Sydney University today and somewhere in South Africa tomorrow, whatever. You know, there is something to this, that this globalized elite has a very, very strong set of ideas. One of them is that the nation states have belonged to the past. And I think we shouldn't go for this. We should admit that, as I said, freedom and the nation state, individual freedoms and the nation state are intricately linked. You know, I mean, there was this one more point. The European Court of Human Rights had a beautiful promotion clip around the time after around the Brexit referendum. It was with Ben Kingsley, you know, eminent actor. So Ben Kingsley plays a British Prime Minister who actually harks back to a Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian, when Ben Kingsley, as Prime Minister, asks his people, what did the European Court of Human Rights ever do for us? And sure enough, you know, they're all dumbstruck until a guy in the last row raises his hand and said, but yeah, like women's rights, for example. And Ben Kingsley says, yes, okay, women's rights, okay, but what else did the European Court of Human Rights ever do for us? And so on, until at the end he's forced to say that besides human and civic rights, women's rights, generational rights, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, freedom of organization, the ECHR has never done anything for us. And of course, you know, it makes his own thesis absurd. It's very well done. Well, my only comment on that is, it's not the ECHR that guarantees this when push comes to shove. It is the armies and the police forces of individual nation states that guarantee my rights when push comes to shove, right? And you know, I wish there would have been these 5 seconds to say that at the very end of otherwise a masterful promotion clip against, you know, provincial attitudes about Britain's role in Europe and during the Brexit referendum.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Well, I have just a couple of comments on that one. The questions. The first comment is about the marginal of INF. Well, it is true that Russia is breaking this INF for quite a long time. But, you know, Russia was raising in sort of private talks, you know, the issue of INF quite a long time ago because of China. Now, this is something which they claim that, you know, Chinese obviously are not somehow limited by this INF, and they are, and they feel somehow sort of, you know, at a disadvantage. And that's why I think that we should certainly, again, I'm not a very great fan of Donald Trump, but I think that his sort of indication that INF should be replaced by trilateral agreement, well, that it has some merit. But my other comments are this. Well, clearly, we are at present, you know, witnessing the growth of autocratic systems and regimes. This is not something new. Well, you already mentioned the situation after the First World War. But I don't think, at least I do hope, that this is not something which is totally different. Because after all, if you look at Huntington and others, sort of, you know, analysis, they claim that, you know, this autocracy can sort of coexist with economic growth up to a certain point. After all, that happened in South Korea, in Taiwan, in many other. And China is far below this threshold of $8,000 per capita. So, well, unfortunately, maybe we still have to wait, which could be a consolation that could be the outcome. About globalization, well, the problem is that in every country, the feeling that, you know, globalization is a threat is somehow combined with the feeling that this country can probably do better sort of on a national level. And the reason why it is so, I think it rests that in national level, there are all instruments, you know, at present, they are ready. But clearly, you know, you cannot cope with globalization on national level unless you will sort of, unless you will decide to sort of drift gradually into sort of a autarkic or self-isolationism system. So I think that the only response to globalization is to confront the problems of globalization on a much larger scale, and that's Europe. And that brings me to the issue of European Union. It is true that, you know, the push for change should come from nation states. But it was always the case, maybe with the exception of Philip of the Lord, who really was a visionary. But basically, it always was somehow the result of this push. The question always in which direction. Because when Orban says that we are future of Europe, he means we are future of totally different Europe. This is the problem. The same Kaczynski says. So I think that without a very major debate, what process, but in which direction the process should go. That's, it will be very difficult to cope with this problem. And I think that the forthcoming elections to the European Parliament is a good opportunity actually to start intensifying this debate. And let's hope that will be something fruitful. And my question is this, after these comments, what about common European defense and security policy? There are sort of Loch Ness monster in form of European army, this PESCO, which I'm very pessimistic about. I think that this would be just a failure. This PESCO, which we have now. What Europe can do is just to really create a certain capacity to act.
Okay. European Common Defense and Security
Well,
Policy.
that's easy. I share, Janusz, your doubts because, after all, there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical of PESCO, for example, and we would be even more skeptical if the European defense system were built outside, so in a sort of strategic autonomy vis-à-vis the United States, because I think there is a saying in Germany. Zwei Fußballeste laufen nicht schneller. So if you two crippled people do not run faster than one. If we add all the problems we are having in our nation states, that does not make us stronger. And of course, there is a lot of good ideas about pooling and sharing and so on, but there is no good idea about the decision-making process. And that's of course the very essence of the problem. We have in Germany, Roland spoke about the weakness of the German armed forces, which is really simply unbelievable. But then there is another problem, the political problem of the so-called Parlamentsvorbehalt. This is an army of the parliament. But imagine something happens and the German Bundestag has to come together and starts a debate. Well, that may be too late for some countries to wait for the result of this debate. And that makes, of course, NATO so important, especially for those who believe, for whom the security issue is a real vital issue, and not just a question of, let's say, self-confidence of Europe as a great power, but a real vital issue, like the Baltic countries and Poland especially. I believe, by the way, and I'm trying to encourage people in Germany writing about that and also talking to politicians. I believe Germany could make a sensible contribution to the European defense system by investing in Poland and in the Baltic countries. Why not do that? Of course, that not instead of investing in the Bundeswehr, because the Bundeswehr is in a shape that, of course, makes it almost irrelevant. But there is a lot of concerns in Germany that if Germany invests too much, it might be perceived by the neighbors as a military power, as a dominant military power. from today's point of view, this is of course laughable. But some Germans say, look at the French defense budget and look at the German defense budget. If we spend 2% of our GDP, then this is 80 billion euros. The French are spending 40 billion euros. And if we continue over 10 years, well, we will get a beautiful imbalance. Will the French like it? Today, of course, this is an excuse, because given the current situation, this is nothing, just an excuse. But if the Germans are afraid of that, then they should be creative, and I'm trying to help them with that.
Yeah, agreed. The thing is, when we talk about the European army or even the European defense, I think we're really cheating ourselves. Because this is not about territorial defense. This is about improving our capacity to intervene in a certain segment of the neighborhood. You know, I don't mean the eastern one. No one talks about EU intervention capacity in the east. It's about the Balkans and the south. North Africa, Middle East, or Sub-Saharan Africa. So if we could get there and realistically improve our capacities, I think we would do a good thing. Now, you know, the other question intrigues me too. Which Europe? As much as, you know, Angela Merkel would stand for a multicultural, multi-religious Europe. And of course, then Viktor Orban stands for a largely white and largely Christian Europe. I would say the question, if these are the answers, then the question is wrongly posed. Because what really matters is that we remain an open society. But we don't even have an agreement on the value of an open society at the moment. So, you know, this is not a clean-cut East-West conflict. There is debate in Western Europe too. As you saw yesterday, there's still life in this civil society, in this country. So it's not cleanly East-West, but of course, if you look at some governments, it is an East-West conflict, and the Visegrad group seems to be particularly determined upon representing its own identity in these questions of rule of law, and Europe's future, as well as also certain degrees of social conservatism and so on. So, to make a long story short, I think the only way is, to debate this openly. I don't think we're going to get to a consensus very quickly, but if we could achieve some method how to listen to each other and accept each other's differences, that would already be something. Instead of looking like a continent which is deeply at odds and doesn't even discuss on the same terms at the moment.
Thank you very much, Aldo.
I was interested about somebody talked about the leadership. I think the failure of Europe is a failure of leadership. You talked about Mrs. Merkel. Probably she underestimated what was going on in the southern countries, because I'm talking about, of course, Italy. And I was just wondering, a question for you, what kind of decision making do you see for the next Europe? I mean, for the next Parliament, next Commission, and because at the end of the day, this very, very slow, long decay. From one side, we had a very good period of economic growth that in Germany, for instance, in other countries, they underestimated what was going on at the deeper level, not only in Poland, but in Italy, in Austria, not only the eastern part of Europe. So how do you see the developing of this new decision-making in the different Europe?
Well, I don't think that the European elections will bring much change in this. We're going to see a further growth of nationalist, populist forces. They won't be able to form one caucus or one supergroup, as Steve Bannon called it. couple of months ago, we will see a further decline of the socialists and the EPP, the centre-right. We'll maybe see some growth of the liberals, thanks to Macron, but also very limited. So what we're going to see afterwards is, in determining the coalition president, will be another coalition of the centrists in the European Parliament and in the European Council, indeed. There will be an interesting power struggle between the Parliament and the Council about how to interpret the treaties, about the Spitzenkandidat. German language has bequeathed a lot of interesting words to English, such as Zeitgeist, Weltschmerz, Blitzkrieg, and now we have Schadenfreude, exactly. All these terrible things, and now we have Spitzenkandidat. I mean, it's progress, So, but I'm afraid that this time we'll get another power struggle, which, of course, outside a perimeter of 10 kilometers around the European Parliament and the European neighborhood in Brussels, no one understands or cares about. So, yes, more of the same. Seriously, leadership. There is this slogan in Berlin policy jargon, aus der Mitte führen, right? Leadership from the center. And it worked very well in terms of the Russia sanctions, for example, where Merkel exercised precisely that kind of leadership from the center. She put herself smack in the middle of a wide spectrum of people who wanted to be much tougher on Russia and people who wanted to not to have any sanctions at all, or maybe against 5 oligarchs. And she put herself in the middle, and then leadership is easy. When you put yourself at one end of the spectrum, which is what she did in 2015 with the migration crisis, leadership becomes more difficult. And I think this is something always to be kept in mind. Merkel's reign is coming to an end, obviously. We don't know whether it's going to be a couple of months or a couple of years, but the end is nigh. And, as usual, the successor will be probably someone who everyone will say, Annegret who? Or, how can that person ever succeed Angela Merkel? Well, that's what people said about Angela Merkel when she came in 2005 as a chancellor. So I'm not too pessimistic about this, and we haven't even discussed the Franco-German angle, but I don't think we have the time for that.
A short question on this one. Do we need another call in the round?
Well, we're not going to have it because the times are not what they were in the 90s. In the 90s it was possible that seriously, just by some phone calls, the French president, the German chancellor, and Jacques Delors, as commission president in Brussels, could more or less put things on track or change the direction in this or that question of EU politics in general. Those times are over for good, for many, many reasons. I mean, it's the number of member states, the relative weight of Germany and France in the different EU institutions, and so on and so on. And also, I would claim that seriously, there are some strategic differences between Germany and France that get papered over too easily. And here's something to defend Germany vis-a-vis its critics in German media and outside of Germany in answering to Macron. Many people say that it is the negligence of Germany vis-a-vis Macron's reasonable ideas for Europe's future is punishable, is criminal negligence. Well, I can only say that Germany is doing a very bad job in promoting, in just bringing forward the idea that we don't think that Macron's proposals for the future of the Eurozone really improve things. We don't believe that these are the solutions. So don't accuse us of sluggishness or of passivity or of letting Macron starve in the desert. No, that's not what we're doing. We have different ideas. We want a rule-based framework. We don't want a kind of a transfer union in which some countries can go into debt without limits, and other countries will always have to automatically pay for that. We do not believe that this will improve Europe. So, I mean, why aren't we saying that more loudly? I don't know. I think it goes back to the Birkenstock thing.
I think this is also because Germany is obviously the most powerful country in Europe. On the other hand, the German influence in today's Europe is very limited.
Yeah.
Very limited. And Germany has, to some extent, run out of allies and partners in Europe. Then there is a certain ambiguity in the Macron attitude. He would like to restore a certain exclusivity of the Franco-German relationship. And this is something Germany cannot accept. And this is something I would not like Germany to accept. Because one of the implications would be, for example, that Germany cares less about this part of the European Union, including Poland. I'm not suggesting that Germany can solve the Polish problems, but I believe Germany is the only country that can formulate positive offers for countries in this part of Europe. And if it stops doing it, because all the energy will be absorbed by the partnership with France, which I'm afraid President Macron wishes, then this will not strengthen Europe. Of course, one can say Poland is contributing to this thinking. Yes, absolutely. But the difference between France and Germany when it comes to Poland or Hungary and so on is the French sometimes invite us to do something if we do not say yes enthusiastically, then the French say, well, okay, if they don't want, it's their problem. We don't care. The Germans never do that. If the Poles, and that happens very often, say, oh, we are not sure that this is really an honest offer, then the Germans say, okay, we have to reformulate the offer. And then maybe they ask themselves, what have we done wrong? So we should try again and again and again. Because this is a strategic concept, a strategic relationship, while the French relationship is more opportunistic. And this is why Germany, of course, has some good reasons to be a little skeptical. On the other hand, I value the enthusiasm of President Macron, because what really I think is great, that's the message, what I mentioned earlier on. I'm going to solve my problems not against Europe, but with Europe. So Europe is part of the solution. This is an extremely positive message.
Thank you very much. Yes.
So I have one remark. When Kingsley finally says that and accepts and embraces the European Court of Human Rights as a British invention, so he pays homage to the British nationalism in this short clip that you mentioned. Now, but turning to this question on Britain, where's Germany in post-Brexit Europe? How do you see that? Is it taking an opportunity? Is it actually hoping for it because it can embrace this moment to reshape itself and therefore make a proposition for Europe? Or it is scared of the outcome? And this is very inward debate on Germany question. Second question I have, very short one, would be on the role of Central Europe. There is in the invitation to this discussion a bit of that, but we don't discuss it that much. So let me propose and offer a question on this. It seems for me that Central Europe became awfully influential in all different ways on the future of Europe. It is making its mark by loud saying no, by by showing that within Europe, as constructed by mostly French and German alliance, tandem, there is room for a future of different groupings within Europe. Sanchez-specific group, but it may be Nordic, maybe different other settings. And therefore, again, how do you see the future of potential interactions, and what do you expect of the influence, specifically the Visegrad Group will have on the future shape of the European Union? How many of this process that take place in Central Europe are replicating in the rest of Europe?
Okay, we are running a little bit out of time, so I will ask Roland and Janusz for short answers, and then we take several questions together. Can you go to Brexit and Germany, please?
Right. Okay. So whether
before that.
Absolutely. So the question was whether Germany uses the opportunity to reshape the European Union in Brexit. Was that the question?
Well, reshape its own position in.
Yeah. I think, first of all, Brexit was a painful thing for Germany more than for some people in Paris. I'm not saying France as a whole, but there were some French who were clearly enjoying Brexit, are enjoying Brexit. Hardly anyone in Berlin does. So, and that's simply because if you look at voting patterns in the council or statements of leading politicians on strategic questions, especially in economics in Europe, you know, the German business and political elite always considered Brexit as an ally. So it's a loss to Germany. It's considered a relative loss vis-a-vis a southern European philosophy about economics, the role of the state, budgetary strategy, and all this. So Germany is kind of, even though Britain never was in the euro, but on trade, on many questions also of the EU budget, the EU, the financial framework of the EU, Britain was always considered an ally, and this is gone now, and there is more of a southern power center, of course, kind of focusing on Paris, represented by Paris. Paris is the spokesman also in the Euro crisis of the United South, if you want, in the whole approach to economics. So I don't think Germany will be very defensive here, and will try to make up for the loss of Britain through more strategic alliances with Scandinavia, Netherlands, Austria, and it should actually look at Central Europe as a strategic ally in these questions. But I mean, look at what's happening around Nord Stream 2. Look at what's happening with the migration quota, and coming back to it. You know, Berlin, to a certain extent, has turned its back on the Visegrad Group. And yes, the Visegrad Group was very nice to Berlin, especially some leaders in Warsaw and Budapest weren't very nice to the Germans. But goddammit, if we always had the strategic patience that Janusz ascribed to us very diplomatically a minute ago, we would have waited this out and still seen Visegrad, the country, the individual countries, but also the group as a whole, as a strategic partner after Brexit. And I still have hope that it will be happening sometime in the future. At the moment, it isn't.
Okay, before.
Well, I think the answer depends on whether Central Europe is able to define itself as a group that has positive offers to the entire European Union, or as a group that is connected by resentments. And it's open, frankly speaking. I do not see that many positive offers, but I think that would be great. It would be very valuable. By the way, I believe that the decision by the German government to join the so-called 3 Cs initiative as an associated partner is a good one, because it can be a bridge between those countries and other EU countries. But there is also the dimension that makes me a little bit unhappy, that's the resentment against the West. We have to accept it. This is part of the reality, but this cannot be the driver of this format.
Thank you very much. We are taking the 4 questions together. Start here. Please be short. We are already running out.
From the Center for International Relations, the organization that Ambassador Reiter started over 20 years ago, and I have a question to our founder. You depicted a very gloomy and very pessimistic vision of European perception, and growing feeling, we're talking about growing feeling of disillusionment that European Union, Europe works. So I would like to ask you how you interpret the recent results of Eurobarometer, which shows that there is like a record support for European Union. In Poland itself it is 87%, and in all over Union I think it's less than 70. That's my short question. But of course, you may answer first.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I wanted to ask for a reflection on the recent ruling of the European Court of Justice about the judicial reform in Poland in the broader context. Sort of alluding to what was discussed a bit earlier about values versus interest. What is more in the interest, and then we have of course several actors who may have different interests of the European Union as such. The countries understood as the governments versus the countries as a whole, to accept the breach of certain values on which the European Union is based, such as respect for democracy and independence of judiciary, etc., versus a potential risk of certain countries, namely Poland and Hungary, going the way that the UK went. So in other words, is it worth to fight for the values on which the European Union is based, with the risk of further countries leaving the European Union? Should we even deem it possible or realistic?
Thank you very much. Yes.
I would like to present my short observation about what is happening in Europe. I think that this new conservative thought, which is very interesting in many countries, is not giving responses to any modern problem in the world. And that's a problem, because I would like to buy this new conservative thoughts if I have any question for modern problems like climate change, like inequalities in the world, like instability in the world. And what the EU was after the Second World War, and why it was so interesting, because it was this common myth we were all buying and we were all interested. It was the peace, human rights, and prosperity. And now somehow we got used to it, and we forget what the EU was about. And what I think we are just forgetting is just to show to the nations of Europe what Europe is about, because about all this bureaucracy and things that are happening, people, especially young people, they just forget, and they even don't know what Europe is for. And if Europe is not sexy for them, and if Europe is not giving answers to modern problems, I think it can fail. And what I think the problem is, and it is also about the leadership, is just that Europe should not keep low profile. Europe should say, yes, I'm very important because I'm giving solutions to the problem, I'm basing solutions like peace and prosperity and human rights, but I'm giving you answers to the modern problems, which I think are the technological change and the climate change. And we are not discussing about, we are somehow focusing on things which are not so important. And my question in the end is, how force our European discussion to these basic problems, which I think that young people, they don't see answers, and they don't even know they don't understand for what the EU is, in fact.
Thank you very much. There was one more person. No. Okay. So last one, short please, very short.
Short question. I'm Henry Badal from the College of Europe. So you mentioned European Union needs to share the responsibility in the global order. So recent US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal created an opportunity for the European Union to save the deal and to play an important leadership in the world. So do you think the controversy around the Iran nuclear deal will be a major game changer in the international arena in favor of the European Union? Thanks.
Okay, we have Eurobarometer, we have the AGC and the values, we have the nation states. I will put that as individuals as well, the information, and we have at the end of the day also the Iran and the global responsibility. Why don't we start with the barometer and Iran?
Oh, I don't know this opinion poll.
Published a couple of days ago.
It's
Well,
correct, I've seen it, I can confirm.
Okay, so very high.
87%.
87%. Well, it's good news. However, this is what this does not translate into political conclusions and into political actions. So the question is, what can you do out of it? And this is much more complex. Of course, it can be seen as an encouragement for politicians, but it is extremely difficult to make use of this encouragement. And that's the real problem, because you have here a verbal commitment. But you have, on the other hand, so many real problems that make European leaders act in a different way. Take Italy, or also take Poland. How does it translate into Polish politics? It's not that easy, I'm afraid. And I would like to say a few words about the values and interests. I said I believe it takes a balance between these two dimensions. The question, for example, when it comes to Poland, is not who is right or who is wrong. The question is what works. This is why I'm skeptical of repeated acts of condemnation of the situation in Poland. This is easy. I was in this situation a couple of times when people told me proudly, we are preparing a declaration condemning. Okay, well, and what does it change? It makes you feel more comfortable. It makes you feel proud. You can say, oh, we have done something good for Europe. But would it really change anything in Poland? I'm interested in constructive offers. And I believe Poland is not a lost case. So a lot can be done. But it takes partners on the other side. I'm not advocating to be well understood. I'm not advocating forgetting the values. Europe, if it gives up on the values without having much power, will be absolutely unserious. So the US can play maybe with these two dimensions, power and values, because the US has a lot of power. But Europe has so little power that if it gives up on values, what is left? But there is no simple answer to this question. This is a question of political sensitivity. This is a question of what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl in making politics. And Iran, well, that's the problem. Of course, is. This is not only about opinions, it is also about power, about influence. Europe can condemn the American decision, but the question is, can Europe change the American decision? Can can Europe influence the American decision? No, it cannot. And this experience of their own weakness makes many people, especially in Germany, and other countries, extremely anxious and nervous. Not so much in Poland, but if you want to have influence, you need real power. You have to impress your partner, an ally, like the US. Unfortunately, and especially with this president, because you could speak with the previous president about, well, more abstract things like value of diplomacy, but this president understands the language of power, first of all. So in such a debate, Europe has unfortunately very weak cards, I'm afraid. But this is not pessimistic. This is just, it just says, we have to build a Europe that will really count in the world, not as an expression of ambitions of a few politicians. No, but because this is in our own interest, and this is also in the interest of the Western community, because the US needs actually, whether the US president says it or not, the US needs a strong Europe in the world that is full of competitors and challengers for the Western community.
Thank you very much, Roland.
On the question of the really important issues for young people, I mean, if young people across the European Union and within the member states could all agree on what is important, if these young people would actually maintain this opinion for their entire lives, then we'd be in a much easier situation, but that's not reality. And I'm afraid the question of what is sexy for young people, we have disagreements, and we will continue to have them. That's politics. You know, I think there was something I would call liberal overreach in the last couple of decades, culturally, in Europe, against which Europe's new conservatives are rebelling. They're, you know, packaging themselves as the rebellion from below against those rich, so-called tolerant elites up there. You know, of course, this is a cartoon picture, this is a caricature, but there is a kernel, there is a nucleus of truth in that. When Hillary Clinton talked about the deplorables who vote for Donald Trump, you know, she exactly brought forward a huge wave of resentment by people who don't want to be called deplorables. And I really think, with all my criticism of the PiS government in Poland, I can see how a certain propaganda telling people you have been disrespected by liberal urban elites can be successful, because there was a degree of disrespect of liberal urban elites. I've lived in this country for 7 years. I know that this whole thing about the relationship between the progressive intelligentsia that carries the torch of knowledge into the darkness of the countryside and so on, that is a psychological and therefore also a political problem in this country. So, you know, and we had the equivalent of this in Western Europe in a more subtle and complex way, but it also exists in the West. And George Soros, for example, very much stands for this liberal overreach, which doesn't mean that I in any way agree with the Hungarian government persecuting him and treating him like an enemy of the people. But you know, I have a Voltairean attitude to this. I disagree with everything he said, or any of the things he says, but I would give my life to defend that he may say these things. And that should be our guiding principle for the future of Europe too.
Thank you very much. It's extremely difficult to summarize the debate. It was very interesting, but let me have a go in a few words. First of all, I think that we retain that indeed Europe will not be as before, and we cannot expect that with everything that is going on, etc., etc. Winners and losers, and not only member states, but winners and losers at the level below the member member states, the citizens, the young people, etc., are winners and losers. The role of the nation state has been discussed a lot and many times. What indeed is the role of the nation state? Globalization, the role of globalization, and China. Are we able, as Europe, to stand up to a power of 1.5 billion people like China? At this moment, it's not obvious. Common European defense and security policy needed, but as Roland has said, it's probably somewhere in the unknown, and it will be extremely difficult. No German-French axis in the cooperation with the type of core and veteran expected in the future. I think that we can agree on that. There are a number of other things that we have discussed, but there are 3 things at the end I would like to quickly mention. First of all, I'm surprised that we didn't talk enough about communication. We have to communicate to the young people, and we have to communicate to not to the member states, not to the nation, to the people, not to the nation. What is Europe about? What is Europe doing for you? Obviously, then the question is, what are you doing for Europe? But the first thing is that we do not communicate the positive messages. The press is communicating the negative messages, and that's one of our key problems. The second is that I'm surprised that there was no question on the role of civil society. The civil society in all these things has an important role to play. And we have not been discussing it, at least I didn't hear that. Last but, sorry, you mentioned it, but I think it's an interesting debate in itself, as a matter of fact. Last but not least, and I agree with what you have said, we need to have a discussion about what kind of Europe we want. We don't have it at the level of the member states, we don't have it in the Czech Republic. We are still discussing what is our vision about Europe. I don't think that we as Europeans, we don't have a vision what Europe of tomorrow, what the past Brexit Europe, if you want to be practical, is going to or should look like. I think it's just about the time to have it, and the best is probably to start as soon as possible, and surely before the European elections, as it has been mentioned. Thank you very much. Thank you to our